Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the top 10 albums by the piano man himself, Billy Joel. Billy was born in the Bronx in New York, of course, in 1949. He had piano lessons as a young boy before dropping out of high school and going on to form local rock bands like the Hassles and then the wonderfully named Attila. He eventually signed a solo deal with Family Productions in 1971 and released his debut album Cold Spring Harbor the same year. And he went on to make 12 solo albums of pop and rock music and one album of classical music before retiring really from making records at a very young age. His double album is one of the best-selling albums of all time. And he's often seen as America's answer to Elton John. And in fact, Elton and Billy often toured together in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, before sadly falling out with each other. And I think they remain out with each other, as it were. He's one of the best-selling artists of all time. He's sold over 160 million units, and he's very rightly regarded, I think, as one of the great American singer-songwriters. I think his ability to pen a hit is up there with the best of them. But, you know, is there more to Billy Joel than Piano Man and Uptown Girl? Well, let's take a look at his top 10 albums and find out. At number 10, I'm going to put his 12th and final pop rock album from 1993, River of Dreams. This is Billy's final album at the age of 44. Who knew that he'd be courageous enough to say, that's it, that's all I've got to say at such a young age. And as final albums go, this is kind of quite a serious one with a fairly somber, slightly angry tone, with many of the lyrics dealing with the financial issues he struggled with his entire career. He was embezzled by former managers with dubious accounting skills. He'd been financially betrothed to Family Productions his entire career, having only made his debut album with them. And he's propped up by an army of session players on this record as well, and there's 4 producers here, but he still manages some half-decent tunes. 2,000 Years, All About Soul, Famous Last Words, and of course the big hit River of Dreams. But, you know, this to me is the sound of a man who's had enough of the business world around him. And I think that's interesting because Billy does still play live. He still loves music. He hasn't retired, but he doesn't make records anymore. And I wonder if there was a straw that just broke the camel's back for him and he was fed up of all the business dealings. The album's still at number 3 in the UK and number 1 in the US. So for a final album, he was still delivering the success and the hits. At number 9 from 1989, I'm going to put Stormfront, his 11th album. Much with the previous album, The Bridge, Billy is still in a kind of late 80s production rut here. He's much better when he's searching for his own sound rather than chasing others, I think. That said, this album still had a couple of huge hits. It's got I Go to Extremes and the huge worldwide hit and much parodied song We Didn't Start the Fire. It doesn't sound as 80s as The Bridge, the album that preceded it, but there is an element of kind of Bon Jovi hair rock here, probably due to the fact that the album was produced by foreigner mainstay and producer Mick Jones. That said, it was still nominated for 5 Grammys, and it was his 3rd Billboard #1, and it was a solid commercial effort. At number 8, I'm going to put his 10th album from 1986, The Bridge. So, you know, with Billy having so successfully navigated the shift into the 80s, which we'll talk about later, by the mid-80s, 1986, he suddenly sort of dove headfirst into the production techniques of the time, and as a result, it's not a hugely popular Billy Joel album, but I do quite like it. It's you know, it is very much his 80s album, and you all know what I think of 80s production and stuff. But stylistically, I think is the problem here. It feels a little bit all over the place. You know, there's big band jazz, there's kind of new wave stuff here, but I do think a lot of the songs on here stand up just about. You're Running on Ice, This Is the Time, Baby Grand, A Matter of Trust. I think the songwriting and his voice rise above the production. That's basically what I'm trying to say here. And they create a decent listen, but I do think the cracks were beginning to show, not least with his longtime band members, Doug Stoegmeyer on bass guitar and Russell Javis, who'd been with him for years and years. They were starting to sort of fall out in recording sessions, and in fact both of those members left the band after making this record. It's also his last record he made with longtime producer Phil Ramone, and many critics felt this was the point that Billy kind of lost his golden touch. Billy himself has said that he would much rather have been at home with his newborn baby daughter than in the studio working. So, I suppose that's fair comment. At number 7, from 1973, I'm going to put his second album, Piano Man. So after a sort of likeable but unremarkable debut album, Billy found himself in legal difficulties with his label Family Productions. And after finally wrestling himself free with quite significant caveats, he signed with Columbia. And I think the bigger stage and the bigger budget did him a world of good. He seemed to have learned very, very quickly how to maintain the listener's interest over a whole album. And Piano Man is where he really starts stretching his style, delivering ballads, and there's sort of bluegrass country here with Traveling Man. There's huge mini epics like Captain Jack. And of course the jazz lounge piano balladry on the classic title track, which is the song that's pretty much gone on to become Billy's signature tune and gave him, of course, his nickname. Some of it does feel a bit lightweight, I think, but credit to Michael Stewart, the producer, for developing Billy's sound. And there's also some great names playing with him on this record, including Larry Carlton on guitars and Ronnie Tutt, Elvis's drummer no less, on drums. Album peaked at number 27 and eventually went gold, but the royalties were not flooding in. A lot of that was to do with how much he was financially betrothed still to Family Productions, even though he'd left that label. And this was a sign of the financial issues that were just going to plague and dog Billy throughout his entire career. At number 6, I'll put his fourth album from 1976, Turnstiles. This may seem a little bit low for some of you die-hard Billy fans. This was seen as kind of Billy's return to New York album. He'd spent a bit of time in LA, and in fact, this album opens with Say Goodbye to Hollywood, and you've also got, of course, the classic and beautiful New York State of Mind on here as well. Originally, he recorded this album with members of Elton John's band, but he wasn't happy with the way it was going, so he took over the production of this album himself and hired players like drummer Liberty DeVito and guitarist Russell Javers, both of whom would become mainstays of the Billy Joel band over the subsequent years. I think this album is an album of the sound of a man really brimming with a lot of confidence and music. You kind of really feel like he's about to break through to a much wider audience. It's full of very, very popular deep cuts, and it's no surprise that when he released his live album Songs in the Attic, he dusted off many of the deep cuts from this album to put onto that record. And this album is actually regarded by many diehard Billy fans as one of the absolute best. I just happen to think that there are better records in his collection, so let's talk about those. At number 5, I'm going to put from 1978 his 6th album, 52nd Street. This is often called Billy's jazz album. The album itself is named after a hub of the jazz community in New York, which was on 52nd Street. And he's just had this huge success with The Stranger, but he didn't really want to repeat himself and decided he was going to move into a more jazzier direction. This album opens with Big Shot, but you've also got My Life and Honesty, so it's front-loaded with cracking tunes, all of which hit the top 40, and the album itself won 2 Grammys. There's also fans' deep cut favourite Zanzibar on here, and the album is infused with that jazzier instrumentation and those jazzy chord changes that give it a slightly different feel to many other Billy Joel albums. Freddie Hubbard himself even pops up on one track, and there's even shades of Steely Dan here and there, which is never a bad thing. The reception to the album overall was good, and the album's now ranked 354 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time. And as far as needing a serviceable follow-up to the monster that was The Stranger, this was very much job done. And as an aside, this is often cited as the very first album to ever be released on CD. So at number 4, I am going to put his 8th album, Nylon Curtain, from 1982. This was Billy's attempt to mirror small town life in America, to peer behind the nylon curtain, if you will, and examine the lives of everyday Americans, from steel mill workers to Vietnam vets returning home. And the album contains 3 enormous Billy Joel songs. You've got Allentown itself, Pressure, Good Night Saigon. You know, by this point, great songs, strong singles, they seem to be just dripping from his fingertips. It's a beautiful sounding record produced by Phil Ramone, and Billy said that this was the record he spent the most time perfecting sonically. And he shifts his style subtly here, and sometimes not so subtly actually, to create little movie moments for the ear. You know, so you listen to the atmosphere and how beautifully it's developed on Good Night Saigon, and he even pastiches the Beatles on Scandinavian Skies. The album peaked at number 7 and had sales of 2 million, and that was actually a little bit of a disappointment after the huge success of The Stranger and Glass Houses. But Billy Joel himself often cites this as his personal favourite, and the album with the material he's most proud of. At number 3, from 1980, I'm going to put his 7th album, Glass Houses. He's always had a knack, Billy, for front-loading his album with killer singles, and this one opens with one of his absolute best tracks, You May Be Right. But you also get Don't Ask Me Why and the fabulous Still Rock and Roll to Me, which was his first number 1. And even on that first side, you've got the very new wave Sometimes a Fantasy. So, you know, this is kind of Billy Joel's first rock album. It was a real shift for him. It's the songs, and they're not piano based. And he was moving into the 80s with a really, really keen ear for new wave sounds. So although the piano's still there are spiky little guitar riffs, there are sound effects everywhere, there's keyboards all over the place. It's a really, really good album, this. I suppose if there's a criticism, it's that it's so front-loaded on the first side. The side 1 of this record is so good that it really overshadows side 2. And what's interesting, I think, of all, you know, there are so many classic singer-songwriters from the late 60s, the 70s, who were struggling to find relevance and find their sound in the 80s. You can find examples of that just all over the place. But Billy Joel seemed to just effortlessly move into the new decade. This is one of the, I think this is something like the 41st best-selling album of the entire 1980s. It was another Grammy win. It sold over 7 million copies in the US alone. And by this point, Billy Joel was a bona fide superstar. At number 2, I'm going to put, from 1983, his 9th album, An Innocent Man. And this is Billy's soul album. It's his love letter to the pop music of America from the late 50s and the 60s. And it draws heavily from Motown and 50s doo-wop. And so it's an album that kind of lyrically takes a modern perspective on things and marries it with those retro tunes and the instrumentation. And you know what? I think it works beautifully. I really do. I mainly to the strength of the songs. That's where the success lies. And there's a ton of killer tracks on here. The Longest Time, Tell Her About It, Leave a Tender Moment Alone, of course the mega worldwide hit Uptown Girl. The chutzpah here is dazzling. It's, you know, his voice is at the top of its game. His songwriting sensibilities are sharp as a tack, and this may have a lot to do with the fact that he was newly divorced and he was dating supermodels, and in fact, of course, he ended up marrying Christine Brinkley. And he says he felt like a teenager at the time of making this album, and all the songs came very, very easily to him. So easily that seven of these songs were released as singles. And the album went on to sell 7 million copies in the USA and stayed in the charts for 111 weeks. Uptown Girl was his first UK number 1. And really, the album would have been an even bigger success had it not been overshadowed in 1983 by what else? But of course, Thriller, which just about beat this album to a significant Grammy win. But number 1, my top Billy Joel album, may not be a surprise to many of you. It's his 5th album from 1977, and it is, of course, The Stranger. This is the album that made Billy Joel a superstar. And it all didn't it all really nearly didn't happen. He was on the verge of being dropped by Columbia, who were not seeing the return financially that they were hoping for. And originally this album was going to be produced by George Martin, which got Beatles fame, of course, which got everybody excited. But George didn't want to work with Billy Joel's band. Players like Liberty and Russell Davies, who had now really become very much a part of Billy's sound. So, staying true and loyal to his band, Billy dropped the idea of working with George Martin and hired Paul Simon producer Phil Ramone, with whom he was going to go on to make 5 records with. And I think together they have made one of the great pop rock singer-songwriter albums. The track listing here is so strong and it's so consistent. Sorry. There's a car alarm going off outside. Track listing here is so strong and so consistent. Moving Out, The Stranger, Only the... Okay, all right. Turn it off now. Where was I? Moving Out, The Stranger, Only the Good Die Young, Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, and of course Just the Way You Are, which is now a standard covered by a huge range of artists, not least a classic version by Barry White, The Walrus of Love. It's crucial that he uses his own band here, because they add real muscle to these songs. The guitars are a bit more prominent than we've had on Billy Joel albums before. The rhythms are much stronger, and it sounds far less like a piano-led singer-songwriter album and more like a band, and I think that's a positive thing. It sold 10 million copies, 2 Grammys for Record of the Year and Song of the Year, 4 singles in the top 40, but it never got to number 1. It spent 6 weeks at number 2, but it is to this day Billy Joel's biggest selling album, and it's Columbia Records' best selling album of all time as well, beating Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel, who we covered recently. It's number 67 in Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time, and it's just won many, many other accolades besides. And I think it's one of the great 70s albums, and absolutely the place to start if you are new to Billy Joel. So, I mean, if you do want to explore Billy a bit more, I think the top 4 albums here are all very, very fine records. But after that, I think you pretty much have him covered. Outside of this 10, he made Cold Spring Harbor, his debut album, and Street Life Serenade, neither of which are bad albums by any stretch. They're just not that interesting. And he himself has said they're both a little bit uninspired. He's made some great live albums, Songs in the Attic being the first one, which is kind of full of deep cuts in a very positive way. And he made, in 2001, Fantasies and Delusions, a classical record, which is very listenable. He continues to play live to this day. He's a great performer, and he has had a very, very long residency at Madison Square Garden, where all kinds of guests turned up, from Dave Grohl and Rick Astley to AC/DC's Brian Johnson. But look, there's my Billy Joel top 10. Let me know what you think of Billy Joel. Let me know what you think of my top 10. What are your favourite Billy Joel albums? I look forward to reading all your comments. And I'll see you again soon for another Rock Records review. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.